Okay, so I want you to picture something. A human embryo.
Hmm.
But not the one you see in a textbook, Not the cute, calm image. I want you to imagine looking at it under like a super high-powered microscope at about 4 weeks old.
Right.
If you didn't know what it was, you wouldn't say, oh, look, the miracle of life. You'd probably think, you'd think this is a disaster.
It looks like a war zone.
Exactly. It looks like total, absolute chaos. You've got cells migrating violently. You've got tissue literally tearing itself apart to make room for new things.
And things are growing and dying at the same time at this incredible speed.
It looks like a system in complete collapse.
But it isn't collapse.
Yeah.
It's morphogenesis.
And that right there is the hook for today. We're looking at a world that I think for a lot of us feels exactly like that 4-week-old embryo. You turn on the news and what do you see? You see borders dissolving, you see trade wars escalating, technology is just moving way faster than we can control it. And there's this overwhelming feeling that the whole system, the international order, is broken.
That the machine is broken down.
Yeah, and we look at that and we call it failure.
We call it failure because we're using the wrong metaphor.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the core argument of the research we're looking at today.
Right.
We tend to see the world as, a machine that's supposed to run smoothly.
Or a fully grown adult body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A fully formed body that's suddenly gotten sick.
Yeah.
So when we see conflict, we call it a bug. When we see inequality or, intense competition, we call it a pathology.
We're assuming the baseline should be stability.
We assume stability is the default, yeah. And that anything that deviates from that is an error in the system.
But the research we're diving into today, it's called the Global Embryo, Morphogenesis of the World's Superorganism.
Yeah.
It just flips that table completely. It asks this really radical question.
Well,
what if these aren't bugs?
What if they're features?
What if we're not looking at a dying adult, but a developing embryo?
It's a massive shift in perspective.
Okay.
A huge one. Because if you start to look at the world through the lens of, say, developmental biology, instead of just political science, then suddenly the chaos isn't a sign of the end times. It's the messy, violent, but ultimately necessary process of a new organism taking shape.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and bridge that gap. We're going to take some pretty heavy biological systems theory and map it directly onto what's happening geopolitically.
Right.
We're going to look at why nations fight, why some countries seem to be merging or even disappearing, and, where all of this is actually heading.
And I think we need to be really precise here. When we use the term superorganism, we're not being, poetic.
No, this isn't just a nice metaphor.
Not at all. The source argues this is a structural reality, that we're moving from a planet of isolated, sort of autonomous parts, the nation states, to a single integrated living system.
Where the parts literally can't survive on their own anymore.
Exactly. A liver can't just decide to leave the body.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of this. You used the word morphogenesis a minute ago. I know the root's morph is shape, genesis is creation. But what does that actually look like in biology? And why is it so violent?
So morphogenesis is just the process of an organism getting its shape. And it's all about the organized movement and specialization of cells.
Okay.
But like we said in the intro, the cells are not in some kind of tranquil cooperation. They are competing vigorously.
They're fighting over resources? Is that what it is?
They're fighting for everything, for signaling molecules that tell them what to become. They're jostling for physical space. They're competing for nutrients. There is this immense, constant internal friction.
Right.
But, and this is really the key insight from the source material, that friction isn't a problem. It's a prerequisite for structure.
So without the fighting, nothing gets built.
Nothing gets built. Without that pressure, without that competition, the cells wouldn't know where to go. They wouldn't know what to become. The friction is the information.
That's such a wild reframing, because when you look at geopolitics, you see nations in these zero-sum economic games or military posturing, and the default reaction is, oh, diplomacy has failed.
We see it as a breakdown of communication.
Yeah.
A failure.
Yeah.
But this theory argues that conflict isn't a breakdown. It's a metabolic driver. I mean, think about the energy of the global system. What really drives the circulation of capital around the world? What drives the frantic pace of innovation?
Well, usually it's the desire to win,
Right.
To dominate your neighbor, to get an edge.
Exactly, the desire for dominance. In this embryological model, capital is the blood of the system. And that blood needs to be pumped to the frontiers of the organism to build new, complex structures. If everyone is just happy and comfortable and stable, the blood doesn't move. You need a pressure gradient.
Yeah.
You need friction.
And the source gives a really fantastic historical example of this, the space race.
Yes, the space race.
I was hoping we'd get to this because I think for my generation, we look back at the Cold War and the space race with a bit of cynicism.
Yeah.
You know?
You see it as wasteful.
Totally. It just seems like two superpowers posturing, spending these insane percentages of their GDP just to plant a flag on a rock. It feels like a massive vanity project.
It feels wasteful. Of course it does. But if you look at it biologically, through this lens, that wasteful conflict forced the global organism to invest huge amounts of energy and resources into building out its exploratory capacities.
And its communication network.
It was never really about the moon. The moon was just the lure. The result of that competition was satellite technology, GPS, advanced material science.
So the conflict basically tricked the nations into building the infrastructure for the entire world.
Precisely. The friction of the Cold War was the very mechanism by which the global brain began to wire itself together. I mean, think about it. Without the existential threat of nuclear annihilation, do you really think the U.S. government would have poured all that money into funding ARPANET?
No, probably not.
And we can bring that right up to the present day. Just look at the so-called AI arms race.
Which feels, frankly terrifying to a lot of people. Every other week, there's some new manifesto about how AI is going to end humanity. It feels like a huge existential risk.
And from the perspective of an individual cell, it might be. But from the perspective of the superorganism, that intense competition is a developmental signal.
How so?
The fear of falling behind, that existential dread you mentioned, is what's forcing nations and corporations to pour billions and billions of dollars into data centers, into fiber optics, into processing power.
We're building the global nervous system.
We are quite literally building the global nervous system. So the friction, the threat, it's the architect.
Yes.
The source argues pretty convincingly that if everyone were just getting along perfectly, there would be zero metabolic pressure to build these incredibly complex, high-level systems. The friction of the current tech wars is the mechanism. The organism is forcing its cells, us, our nations, to construct the infrastructure it needs to think.
It's almost like the system is using our own ambition against us. Or maybe not against us, but for its own purposes.
That's a very sharp way to put it.
We think we're fighting for national superiority or market share, but what we're actually doing is just laying down the neural pathways for something much, much bigger than us.
That's it. The intent of the parts, the individual nations, is dominance. But the outcome for the whole of the world system is development. This is what the source means when it talks about the metabolic utility of conflict. It turns the bugs of war and competition into the features of growth.
But this growth process, it's not just about building new things up. It's also about, well, getting rid of things. And this brings us to a section of the research that I found, I have to say, pretty dark. We need to talk about the nation state as a proto-organ and what happens when some of those proto-organs aren't needed anymore.
This is where the biological analogy becomes quite ruthless, but it's also very illuminating when you look at the current world map. We have to introduce the concept of apoptosis.
Programmed cell death.
Correct. In the very early stages of life, an organism produces a massive excess of cellular material. It just makes more of everything. More connections than it needs, more tissue than it can possibly sustain.
Okay.
And as it develops, it has to go through a pruning process, apoptosis. It systematically clears away the redundant or inefficient structures to make way for the streamlined, specialized ones.
So in an embryo, you might grow webbing between your fingers, and then the body gets rid of those cells.
Exactly that. Those cells are programmed to die to create a more efficient functional hand.
Yeah.
Now, apply that to the geopolitical map.
Okay, hold on. You're throwing around words like redundant and transitional, but let's be really clear about what that means. If a nation state is redundant in this biological model, the solution is, it just disappears.
In biology, yes. It gets absorbed or it dies off. The source is, as I said, quite ruthless here. It argues that in this embryonic phase of the world superorganism, you just produce way more tissue than you ultimately need. Once the vital organs start really forming and crystallizing, that extra tissue have to go.
It clears the way.
It clears the way for the specialized cells that have a clear function.
But clears the way is a euphemism for state failure. We're talking about economic collapse, loss of sovereignty, maybe even civil war. Does the source actually argue that this is necessary?
It argues that it's inevitable. I mean, look at the post-Soviet bloc in the 1990s. Or look at what's happening in parts of the global south right now. The argument isn't that these places should suffer, but that structurally, many of them are functioning like, say, kidney tissue trying to exist outside of a body.
What does that mean?
Well, a kidney can't filter blood if it doesn't connect it to an artery and a vein. It has no function on its own. It needs to be integrated into the larger circulatory system.
So if these smaller, unspecialized states don't integrate, if they don't join a major trade bloc or sort of submit to a superpower's gravity, they just wither and die.
They undergo necrosis, or they get absorbed. The source explicitly points to things like the expansion of the EU or NATO, not just as political empire building, but as the organism actively recruiting useful tissue and discarding what it can't integrate.
So the kidney cells have to join the kidney organ or they die off.
Or they die off. That's the cold logic of it.
That is a chilling way to look at international alliances. It's not friends working together for mutual benefit. It's tissue aggregation.
It's tissue aggregation. But we also have to look at the structures that aren't redundant. And this is a crucial distinction the source makes between these transitional tissues and what it calls the vital organs.
Right, the superpower.
Yes. In this model, a superpower isn't just a big country with a lot of bombs and a big economy. It is a biological node. It's a point around which the rest of the body crystallizes.
The source used the metaphors of the heart and the brain, which I thought was really powerful.
Incredibly powerful. A superpower might function as a heart, driving financial liquidity, the blood, through the entire system, pumping capital everywhere. Or it might function as a brain, directing technological and cultural signaling for the whole organism.
And the implication there is massive, because if you remove a kidney, or if a small redundant state fails, the body can live. It's painful, but it survives. But if you remove the heart...
Systemic collapse. Total death of the organism.
Yeah.
And that, the source argues, is why the stability of these vital organ states is so absolutely critical to the world system.
So a failure in a smaller state is a localized problem, like a bruise.
A bruise, exactly. But if a vital organ fails, let's say a complete collapse of the US dollar or a total implosion of the Chinese manufacturing sector, the entire superorganism dies.
And this is why we're seeing this consolidation of power.
That's the argument. The body is instinctively protecting its vital organs, sometimes at the expense of the peripheral tissue, while letting the redundant stuff merge or just fade away.
It really, really challenges that democratic ideal that all states are created equal, at least in a functional sense. It basically says, no, structurally, some of you are the heart and some of you are, well, your tissue that needs to differentiate or disappear.
And that differentiation is the next logical step in the process. Once you've pruned all the excess, the remaining cells have to get really, really good at doing one specific job.
This is the specialization of labor on a global scale.
Exactly. In a very early embryo, you have pluripotent cells. They can kind of do anything.
Yeah.
But in a mature adult organism, a liver cell doesn't try to be a brain cell. It would be a disaster. It specializes.
And the source outlines this functional map of the world that it sees emerging. It's fascinating because it divides the globe not by political ideology, not by continent, but by biological function.
It creates this fascinating triad. And yeah, if you're listening, you might want to pull up a mental map here, because it stops looking at traditional borders and starts looking at, well, biology. First, you have the digestive system.
Okay, so who's doing the digesting?
These are the regions that specialize in raw resource extraction. The source points specifically to what it calls the global South Belt. So large parts of South America, Africa, and the Middle East. Their biological imperative is intake. Their job is to pull raw material lithium, oil, cobalt, grain from the environment and process it for the rest of the body.
Which historically and even today we've often called exploitation.
Of course.
Right.
From a human rights or political perspective, it often looks like exploitation. But from a purely biological systems perspective, it's nutrition.
And then you pass that nutrition on to the musculature.
You pass it to the musculature. This would be the major manufacturing hubs.
So East Asia.
Primarily East Asia, yes.
Yeah.
Their function is to take that raw energy and convert it into physical structure, into goods, into infrastructure, into container ships. They provide the physical movement and the growth of the organism.
And then finally you have the cortex.
The cortex. North America and Western Europe, this is the nervous system. High-level information processing, financial signaling, cultural output, and strategic direction.
So the big picture here is that we are moving away from a world where every country tries to do everything, right? Like grow its own food, build its own cars, write its own software.
The generalist model.
Yeah, and we're moving to a world of hyper-specialization. But here's the catch, and the source makes a really big deal about this. A brain can't survive without a stomach.
Not for long, no. And this brings us to what the source calls the interdependence trap.
The trap.
Yeah. I mean, in a 20th century model, A country like the U.S. wanted to be the brain, the muscle, and the stomach all at once. Total energy independence, manufacturing independence, food independence. This new model says, that's over. That's evolutionarily obsolete.
But wait a second, we see headlines about reshoring manufacturing and achieving energy independence all the time. Isn't that countries actively trying to break out of this specialization?
They are trying. Absolutely. The old instincts die hard. But the source argues that the metabolic cost of breaking this interdependence is becoming prohibitively high.
It's just too inefficient.
It's way too inefficient. If the cortex tries to also grow all its own food and build all its own muscles, it becomes slow and clumsy. It loses the evolutionary race to a more streamlined, specialized system. So specialization creates massive efficiency, but it also creates absolute total vulnerability.
So the specialization is actually what creates the cohesion. It forces everyone to stick together.
It creates necessary cohesion. The parts can no longer survive alone. In the past, a nation might have been able to close its borders and, subsist on its own farms and factories for a while.
Right.
In a fully specialized superorganism, isolation is death. If you cut off the blood supply, the organ fails, and the whole body is in crisis. This interdependence is the biological glue that holds the entire superorganism together.
Okay, so let's recap where we are. We've got the friction of competition driving growth. We've got the pruning of redundant states through this apoptosis process. And then we have the specialization of the survivors into this functional triad of digestion, muscle, and cortex. But where is all of this going? What's the end game here?
The teleological endpoint. The purpose of it all. The source is very clear on this. The goal of all this messy, violent development is a state of homeostasis.
Okay, define that for us in this context, because in biology, homeostasis is just maintaining balance, right?
It's the ability of any system to maintain a stable, constant internal environment, regardless of what's happening in the external environment. It's the very definition of a healthy, mature, adult organism.
Like your body temperature.
Exactly. Think about your own body.
Yeah.
Your temperature stays at roughly 98.6 degrees, whether it's snowing outside or you're on a beach in July. Your heart rate regulates itself. Your blood sugar stays in a narrow band. That's homeostasis.
So the adult state of the world is stability after all this chaos.
That dynamic stability, yes.
Yeah.
The source argues that right now we are in the growth phase, or maybe, more accurately, the adolescent phase.
That feels right.
It does, doesn't it? That's why we have all this volatility. Teenagers are volatile, their hormones are raging, their bodies are changing at a dizzying pace. But eventually, that growth slows down, and you reach a steady state.
And what does that look like geopolitically? Because right now, steady feels like a complete pipe dream.
It looks like the end of zero-sum competition as we know it. I mean, in a mature body, the heart does not try to outcompete the lungs for blood.
It would be suicidal.
It would make no sense. It's a cooperative system. The boundaries and the functions become fixed and stable.
So things like border wars, expansionism.
They're symptoms of adolescence. They're symptoms of a body that hasn't finished forming yet. The source predicts that in the future, homeostatic state will have a balanced number of states, or more likely, regional blocks that act as stable organs.
And the borders between them.
The borders between them will become as stable and as functional as the membrane of a liver. They won't shift around. Their job will just be to regulate what goes in and what comes out.
That sounds surprisingly peaceful. But how do you keep it that way? I mean, even healthy bodies get sick. Even healthy bodies have inflammation or autoimmune responses.
That brings us to the regulation system. And the source talks about the maturation of what it calls hormonal signals.
I loved this analogy, the idea of international law and global finance as hormones.
It fits perfectly, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Hormones are just chemical messengers. They float through the bloodstream and tell different parts of the body to cool down or to speed up or to regulate sugar. The source argues that global finance and digital connectivity are the hormonal system of the superorganism.
Okay, give me a concrete example. How does finance act like a hormone?
Okay, think about the bond vigilantes, or what happens when a country's currency collapses. If a political leader starts making decisions that are fundamentally bad for the health of the organism, say reckless spending that causes hyperinflation or starting unsanctioned war that disrupts supply chains, the global financial markets react instantly. Capital flees the country, the currency crashes, the interest rates on their debt spike.
It's like an insulin spike or a cortisol response.
Exactly. It's a cortisol response.
Yeah.
The system automatically and impersonally cuts off resources to the offending area. We saw a glimpse of this with the speed of the financial sanctions on Russia, or even the market reaction to the UK's mini-budget a few years back. The hormones of the market forced a political correction within days.
So instead of having to send an army to correct a rogue state, the global system just adjusts its serotonin levels, or in this case, cuts off its access to credit.
Precisely. It creates an environment where destructive behavior like all-out war is simply metabolically too expensive and functionally impossible. You don't need a world police force if the fundamental biology of the system prevents the behavior in the first place.
Which brings us to the final section, and honestly the most philosophical part of this whole thing. It talks about the teleology of the superorganism, the grand narrative, and it uses a phrase that really stuck with me: involuntary harmony.
It is a striking phrase. Involuntary harmony.
It sounds a little ominous, doesn't it? It implies we don't really have a choice in the matter.
It definitely challenges our human ego, that's for sure. We like to think that world peace will be achieved because we all sit down and decide to be nice to each other.
Because we evolve morally.
Right, because we have a great awakening. This source says, no, peace will be achieved because the organism requires it to survive and function efficiently. It's a structural necessity, not a moral choice.
So the narrative here is that the future of the nation state isn't that it disappears, but that it's refined, that it's locked into this rigid, functional structure.
Correct. We are moving toward a global body where these specialized, highly integrated organs work in harmony, not because they want to, but because the global nervous system, that web of finance, international law, and real-time data, ensures the survival of the whole over the individual ambition of any single part.
So if a single part, a single organ tries to go rogue,
the system corrects it automatically, just like your body corrects a cell that starts behaving erratically. If a single cell refuses to cooperate with the whole, the immune system targets it, or its blood supply is cut off. The harmony is imposed by the structural reality of the organism itself.
And this reframes everything we're living through right now. The source says the chaos of the 21st century, all this anxiety and fear we talked about at the very beginning, these are just birth pangs.
That's the ultimate takeaway. It's a complete reframing of the present moment. We look at the intense competition between the US and China, or the struggles over sovereignty in Europe, and we see disaster. The source says, look closer.
Yeah.
That competition is the metabolism of innovation. It's what's driving technological development at an incredible speed, the absorption of smaller failing states. That's the pruning of redundancy. It's the system becoming more efficient.
It's basically saying, relax. It hurts, but it's growing.
It's growing. And it's growing into something far more complex and capable and ultimately stable than the sum of its parts. We are living through and witnessing the morphogenesis of a single planetary life form.
So where does that leave us? For the individuals, living inside these cells, what does this all mean for us?
That is the question, isn't it? We are so used to thinking of ourselves, of humanity, as the protagonists of history. But in this model, we're more like the mitochondria.
The power plants.
Power plants. We're the essential cellular machinery that's keeping this much larger superorganism alive and functioning.
It's a humbling perspective, but it also sort of takes the weight of the world off your shoulders in a strange way. You realize the chaos has a trajectory. It's actually heading somewhere.
It suggests that the chaos is not random, it is developmental, and that the destination is homeostasis, a stable, breathing, thinking world.
But it also raises this huge, nagging question about agency, about free will. And I think this is where we really need to leave the listener today. We've talked about how the friction is necessary, how the harmony is involuntary.
Yes. It brings us to a fundamental paradox of this whole idea.
So here's the thought I want you to walk away with. If we accept this model, if we are, in fact, cells in a developing superorganism that is moving unstoppably toward homeostasis, what happens to us?
The provocative question is this. Does this mean individual human agency is merely a biological illusion, a useful fiction designed to serve the health of the whole?
And maybe even deeper than that. Are we prepared to accept a peace that requires the surrender of our ambition to the global nervous system?
Is a world without war worth the price of becoming just a functional, predictable part of a much larger whole?
Something to mull over the next time you see a headline about global chaos. Maybe it's not chaos at all. Maybe it's just the world growing up. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.